So Peter, I saw had sort of an interesting perspective yesterday. I saw a movie, sort of a French auteur movie, and it was, sort of the theme was just despair, human suffering, environmental damage. And the whole theme was about a guy who wanted to commit suicide. And, he's a hippie, he was on the street. I mean, just every conceivable type of suffering. And, but it was with such, the director was with such clarity and so direct, that, I sort of felt happy during the whole movie, and I've seen that too about how I've told you about this, how problems just don't seem quite as it's not quite as problematic. It's not that they're not there, but I think it's the clarity or looking at them and seeing through them that is what's changed. But what is suffering then? What is?
It's an interpretation. Circumstances are circumstances, which are essentially energy conditions apparent energy conditions in experience. But suffering is always interpreted into existence, and suffering is independent of circumstance. You can interpret any circumstance as a cause for suffering, or not. So suffering is never objective. Suffering is always subjective. Suffering is essentially wanting something to be different. How could this happen to me? This shouldn't be happening. That kind of thing it creates suffering. Whereas energy conditions are just energy conditions, and you work with them as best you can, and that's just that.
Well, for instance, what about, say, had a serious illness?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Or an earthquake comes and
sure.
Disaster.
Yeah, all that kind of thing happens all the time.
So are you saying you can sort of see it two different ways? You'd still see an earthquake, or I could still see a sickness.
Of course, but sickness isn't sickness. Sickness is just an energy condition. We call it sickness. The fantasy, I'm supposed to be healthy, and so when I'm sick, that means there's a problem or something wrong.
Yeah.
But all of that is entirely interpreted into existence. You don't know you're supposed to be healthy. You don't know you're not supposed to be sick. You don't know what being sick is. You don't know what being healthy is.
Right.
And so there's just a bunch of weird energy phenomena that occur in experience. And you can't possibly you can't get enough of a handle on it to know whether it's good or bad. And what does good or bad mean? It's only subject to, suppose you get a horrible disease and it's going to kill you. Well, something's going to kill you. A horrible disease, but is it horrible or is it just extreme?
Is it just
extreme? There's all kinds of extreme energy conditions.
Okay, that's I see that. Yeah.
And every energy condition is essentially extreme. It's extremely what it is.
Yeah. So if you're noticing, or realizing that type of energy, then it's not I mean, it might be extreme, but it's not interpreted as good or bad.
Of course. Because there's no way to have a context for it. Context is always defined into existence. See what I mean? You can't assess something in any terms without having a context in terms of which to assess it. And a context like that is always defined into existence, i.e. always imagined. So if something is happening, it's like, well, what does this mean? I don't know. How can you say? It's just a present energy condition. And energy conditions always shift, they're always unexpected.
Yeah, I think that's sort of that was some of the stuff that was happening in that movie is I said it was clear, but it was always in a completely different way than I would probably think about anything that I saw, usually. Everything was just always slightly askew or not.
I mean,
it was out of context is a good word to it.
Fundamentally, energy conditions occur, and this is what we call karma, the energy conditions that seem to occur, and they seem to have some degree of patterning, and there's some degree of, like for example, you're diabetic, so that's part of your energy condition that appears. And was it good or bad? It's just a condition. What do you do? Well, you cope with it as best you can. Mm-hmm. Or anything, or your appearance, or your clarity of thought or lack thereof. All these kinds of things are just essentially a given. They just occur mysteriously, and there's no reason to interpret them as good or bad. You just, they're part of your energy system, and you work with them as intelligently as you can with the resources you have. And there's no intrinsic reason in energy conditions to suffer. Suffering comes from interpreting, this shouldn't be happening. I don't want this to happen. Something else should be happening. Well, yeah, that would be nice. I should be rich, and I should be intelligent, and everyone should love me, and my life should be flawless, and this and that. Yeah, that'd be wonderful. It says who it should, it says me. Well, yeah, I want it to be that. It's like, well, yeah, okay. But should I suffer because that's not the case? It's absurd. It's all fantasy. It's all insanity. Energy conditions, we don't have control over the energy conditions that appear. Energy conditions just appear. And they aren't good or bad, they're just what they are. And ultimately you can't even know what they are, you can't even know anything about them whatsoever. And they're certainly not an intrinsic basis for suffering, or for elation for that matter, except in the fact of the intrinsic positivity of radiance. So, energy presence in itself is exciting, So if anything, experience is already biased towards the positive, not towards the negative. So you have to manufacture and create and supply negativity through interpretation to put it onto these energy pattern presences that constitute circumstance.
Well, it sort of seems like I'm holding two things, not holding, but experiencing sort of two different things. One, I sort of see any type of problem that comes up during the day, and but there's sort of another, and that's just sort of happening sort of in the background.
Uh-huh.
But more and more, it's not I can see it's not a problem. It's just happening.
Yeah, exactly.
As you said.
Yeah. It's just a condition, and conditions have the potential to be dealt with or not, depending upon your wit and abilities to do so, and all of that happens on an ongoing basis. So that's just what we call life, And there's just no actual basis for suffering. Suffering can't exist without a conceptual framework, without a framework of interpretation, without essentially with a worldview. You know, where you're defining yourself, you're defining your conditions, you're defining how things are supposed to be, you're defining the way you think that they are, you're defining the divergence between the way they are and the way you think they're supposed to be, and then you're getting having an emotional reaction to that definition. But all of that exists in imagination. Energy is just present. You know, it's essentially a non-event. It's just like, you know, the sun's shining. Well, so the sun's shining. Is that good? Is that bad? What does that even mean, you know? And again, if there's any fundamental bias in energy presence, it's towards the positive, because the radiance is intrinsically joyful or exuberant, or, you know, it doesn't start off neutral. It starts off as a major wow. You know,
well, especially since, you know, I mean, it seems to generate, you know, thought and emotions and, you know, all this, you know, all this stuff. So when it just lessens, you know, there's a certain, I mean, the joy seems to me comes from sort of being free of.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is what we always talk about. You know, if you are with your experience without interpreting it, it reveals itself to be something drastically different than you're used to thinking it is. And that difference turns out to have a lot of perks, to be very advantageous compared to the ways of being with it that we're used to, where we're used to interpreting it and defining ourselves and defining our circumstances and defining our life and defining all these things, which turns out to be a really losing strategy. It turns out to have very little in the way of upside. Whereas being with this actuality without defining it to be anything, just being with it as it is, turns out to have nothing but upside. So, I mean, this is the difference between delusion and realization. This is the difference between insanity and sanity.
Mm-hmm. That's a very fine line.
Well, it's very fine, but it's also very coarse and gross and obvious.
Yeah, I think it's gross and obvious to see, but to actually live, it's a fine line. Maybe not.
I guess. I mean, you know, it's hard to say. Fineness.
Only if you don't see it clearly.
You know, I mean. Anyway, the fact is, it's possible to be with experience as it is, to be with experience without interpretation. It's doable. It's actually possible. And so,
well, you can see a kind of balance or harmony that happens, especially with animals. And then when that balance is disturbed, there's like visible, invisible, and auditory experience of the effect of that.
I don't follow you.
Well, there's not necessarily a cognition. Well, we don't know. I mean, with animals, but when there's a kind of balance of their, say, physical situation, life goes on as it does. But when something happens and there's harm.
I don't think that's the case at all. I think that it's always in perfect balance or you could say perfect imbalance. There's just circumstances, and circumstances provoke reactions the way that they do, and that's always in a state of constant dynamic equilibrium. I mean, someone runs in the door with an Uzi, and you go flying, hiding behind a chair, or flying out the window or something. It's just, it's balanced. It's a balance. So the Uzi is like pushing down on one pan, and you jumping out the window is like the other side of the balance coming out, or whatever.
Well, I mean, you could say suffering is part of balance. But
No, suffering is not a part of balance. Suffering, well, it is. Essentially, it is, but it is unnecessary because it's imaginary. It's insanity, essentially.
Well, I was just thinking in terms of animals. You can see when an animal is suffering.
Oh no, animals don't suffer.
They have pain.
They have pain, but they don't suffer.
We're assuming they suffer.
Well, whether or not animals suffer is their problem. All you can really know is your own experience.
Right.
And imagining what other beings and life forms and so on is doing is all immediately going into fantasy, of course.
Right.
Even imagining fellow human beings.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. Mm-hmm.
I mean, calling it suffering is dignifying it too much. It's a matter of there's two paths you can go by, and in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on. Which means that you can be with your experience interpreting it, or you can be with your experience not interpreting it.
Yes, okay.
That was a quote from a Led Zeppelin song, for those of you who didn't get the allusion.
I was about to chuckle over in the corner. You recognized it.
Well, I think we're basically talking about pain. Too.
Pain is just energy present.
Pain is different than suffering.
It's like pleasure. It's like light. It's like volume. It's like noise. It's like anything. And pain is always balanced. Pain is, if you stick a knife, if you're walking outside and you step on a sharp rock and it cuts your foot, you feel it. And so there's a balance. There's a cause and effect. There's energy, circumstance, which all works itself out quite in accordance with itself. But even qualifying it as pain is arbitrary. We have the palette of energy, let's say the range of energy experiences, of characteristics that energy presence can seem to have, is literally infinite. And so it's a certain set of those you might arbitrarily say, energy experiences that occur within this range are painful. Energy experiences that occur within this range are beautiful. Energy experiences that occur within this range are pleasurable. Energy experiences that occur within this range are, whatever. But all that classification is arbitrary, and even that is more imagination, because the energy is ultimately unclassifiable.
It seems to be something to be avoided. It's something that we naturally avoid.
Sure. But avoiding is an inconceivable energy phenomenon.
This is natural.
Sure. Natural is a conceivable energy phenomenon. The exercise of intelligence is inconceivable. How does that work? I mean, how do you know not to go under the sink and drink some poison? Because you're smart, you're not an idiot. Well, what does that mean? That means there's some very strange and miraculous functioning of some kind of intelligence in the unfoldment of the engagement of your energy system with itself.
I have two comments.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is you mentioned earlier that we don't have control over the energy. The energy flows
Yes.
as it will.
Yes.
But then I don't. It seems like we don't have control over any of the interpretations as well. They just
Right.
go on.
Yes.
And then I heard you mention in one of the recent tapes that that we have these holding patterns, and if we try to resolve the confusion, which we can't resolve, but we keep trying to resolve it, then we're perpetuating our karma. And I just wanted to know how do we perpetuate the karma by trying to resolve the confusion, or is that maybe?
Well, if you're thinking it's something that needs resolving, if you're thinking there's a problem and then you try to contrive a solution, you're defining all that into existence, which essentially is the creation of karma. So if there's confusion, the solution is not to try and solve it, but to see what it is. You don't remove the confusion, just see the confusion, and you'll discover the confusion is radiant presence. And of course, radiant presence is not a problem intrinsically. Whether you're calling it confusion, or you're calling it clarity, or you're calling it happiness, or you're calling it horror, or you're calling it, whatever, is irrelevant.
However it seems to be used.
Yeah.
Just all the energy.
But as long as you're dealing with circumstances on their own level and trying to manipulate them in terms of circumstances, you are perpetuating karma by paying lip service to it, by thinking it matters. It matters enough that you have to change it. Whereas if you simply see what it is, you discover that it's this astounding, miraculous, essentially divine radiance, and where does it need to change anything?
So, okay, that makes sense. When one makes that shift, or kind of like starts to detach, or is detached.
Well, it's essentially noticing. It's not even really
Or
detachment.
noticing, right, noticing.
It's just being with your experience as it is, rather than insisting on interpreting it.
Yeah.
And even again, it's subtle because, as you say, you're not doing the interpretation; it's just being done too. But you can be with the interpretation, be with the interpreting as it's occurring, and you discover that lo and behold, no surprise, it's radiance too. And so you can watch your own insanity, and you can watch the neurotic mechanisms of your mind, and it's just this amazing light show just coming out from nowhere. Just this incredible Baroque, fractal patternings of insanity just sparkling around, and it's just a trip. It's just a hoot. You can sit and laugh and say, "Wow,
Yeah.
this is who'd have thought?" I couldn't have contrived something this bizarre and Baroque if I wanted to.
Isn't it coming out of your frontal lobe?
Well, it's coming out of what your frontal lobe's coming out of.
Yeah, I had that kind of a acknowledgement today that confusion this is what we, when it happens, when it's there, it's there. It's like that's what we have.
Yeah. The essential nature of radiance is confusion.
Yeah.
Radiance makes absolutely no sense. The patterns that it shows up in are not coherent. They don't follow nice, neat progressions and make sense. They jump around and they're cloudy and hazy, and you can't tell what it is in a moment, and it's already something else, and you can't tell what that is either. And the whole thing is like, confusion is the essential nature of radiance is essentially confusion. But confusion is only confusing when you think it's not supposed to be that.
Yeah.
But then you're interpreting it, which of course generates the potential for suffering and struggle and all those things. Whereas when you're just with the radiance, there's no problem whatsoever. And you might say, "Wow, this looks a little like confusion. This radiance looks a little like confusion." Yeah, okay, cool. That's just a name that you're giving to something that completely is indescribable. And confusion is only meaningful if there was some non-confusion, and there isn't.
Oh. Okay.
Nothing has ever made any sense. You can't get a handle on anything whatsoever. You can't say what anything is or how it happens, right?
Yeah, some things seem to make sense for like a second, and then
Yeah. Well, they make sense because we have these very elaborate,
yeah,
logical sets of rules in our head that we define as making sense, and we can sort of shoehorn circumstances or descriptions of circumstances into those sets of rules temporarily until of course things head south or north or west or whatever, and all of a sudden, woo!
So the interpretations that's just karma.
Yes, interpretation is karma, and perpetuating interpretations is investment in karma, and investment in karma perpetuates it. Not in over time, but just in real time.
Yeah. Right.
If you think your interpretations matter, then that is perpetuating karma.
Mm-hmm.
Right now,
Yeah.
karma is always in the present.
Mm-hmm.
But transcendence is in the present too, if you notice. If you just are with the radiance has no karma.
Mm-hmm.
It has apparent patterning, but the patterning can't be resolved as anything because it's infinite and fractal. In other words, there's a pattern, but you can't find it. You can't. It's not like an outline that's finite and specific, and you can say, okay, that's what it is. It's like you go looking at it and say, wow, there's this pattern. Let me go look at it a little closer, and I'll see what it is. And you go closer, woo, it morphs into something else, and you go closer, woo, forever. So what was the pattern? Well, it's what it is. It's this, but it's not anything. It's like a dream. What's the pattern of a dream I had last night? Why? How can I possibly say that? It's just, it's not coherent enough to collapse into an entity, to collapse into a thing. There was certainly a high degree of patterning, right? But the patterning itself is essentially unpatterned because it's not a coherent patterning. It's an infinite patterning, a fractal kind of patterning.
It seems patterned.
Yeah, it presents itself as patterning, but if you go try and pin the patterning down, you can't.
Yeah.
It's all open-ended and loose ends, and I mean, that's the seduction. That's really what gets us in trouble. Is that the patterns superficially seem coherent. I can look at you and you look just the way you look, and I can look at Nancy and she looks just the way you look, and so there's this one visual pattern, this other visual pattern, and I can think, oh yeah, I've got a handle on it. This is your pattern, and that's. But then I look a little closer. What exactly is your pattern? And I look it up. It's infinite. It's got far too much nuance, far too much implications. And your pattern is, above all, an experience, and experience itself is intrinsically very, very slippery. It's fuzzy, it's unstable, it's dynamic, it's morphing. So your pattern isn't you. Your pattern is my seeing of you, and the seeing itself is very slippery, very subtle. And so all patterns, since they are essentially experienced, partake of this slipperiness and subtleness. And simply noticing that liberates. When you notice that, these apparitional patterns are unresolvable, cool, they're unresolvable, so there's nothing to resolve. You don't need to make sense of anything because it doesn't make any sense. And if you insist on making sense, you have to not look too closely. You have to deal with superficialities. You have to deal with generalities and sloppy definitions.
It feels very weird.
Yeah, it is very weird. I mean, what's happening here is inconceivably weird. And so noticing is opening to that. Noticing is letting go of the pretension of dullness, the pretension of stability, the pretension of consistency, and opening to this strange hyperspatial infinity that experience actually is. Explicitly and obviously, it is that. you can't. It's not like you need to make it that or get to that. On the contrary, you have to really work hard to make anything other than that. You have to exercise a powerful dose of denial and superficiality and not looking too closely in order to make things seem stable and structured and.
But there's also I know I find myself denying the superficiality of my experience, which are all the narratives. I mean, I find myself just kind of throwing those off.
Well, good.
That's happening or stuff.
Well, that's good.
But it's very disorienting in a way. And,
Yeah. Well,
there's no
reality is very disorienting in terms of a normal human worldview.
Yeah, definitely.
Actuality is radically disorienting compared to that. It's complete oil and water. They don't make sense in terms of each other. So, which is why some people, and especially beginners in all of this kind of investigation, find it very threatening, because next to the apparent stability of human normalcy, actuality is very strange and slippery and bottomless and unstable and there's no reference, there's no actual intrinsic reference points, which if you're used to pretending there are, if you're used to believing there are reference points, the fact that being in a referenceless experience of actuality is very different. It's an entirely different mode.
Yeah, definitely. I guess it just to become more comfortable in that space where you're just kind of floating and nothing sticks, and there's no reference point, as you say, and no orientation. You're just kind of floating through space.
But you discover it has some distinct advantages. It has a lot of beauty. It has a lot of interest, because it's impossible to be bored in that context, because everything is always a surprise. Everything is always infinitely detailed and nuanced. So there's no end of fascinating qualities to experience. And there's the great pleasure of detachment. There's the great pleasure of lack of worrying about outcomes. There's so on and so forth.
So, how does the energy play in all that?
Hmm?
How does the energy fold into all of that?
Well, that is the energy. The energy is all of this, all of these patterns, all this radiance, all event whatsoever is energy. I mean, I'm calling it energy.
So the energy is very loose and
Yeah.
slippery. I mean, in a sense, slippery means that you can't really get a leverage on it, or you can't grasp it. Or
Yep, exactly. You can't grasp it. It's very real. It's very actual. In fact, all actuality whatsoever is nothing but the energy. So everything you see is energy presence, right? I mean, physicists call it light presence, or neurologists might call it, presence of neuronal firings or whatever. But on whatever level of the transaction you're looking at it, it's an actual energy event in experience. And so this energy is actual, but if you go looking for it, trying to pin it down and say what it is, again, you can't, because you can't say how it is the way it is. You can't say where it comes from. You can't say where it disappears to. You can't say how it appears. It has essentially no duration, and yet it obviously has sufficient duration to appear. So the whole thing is just very slippery and undefinable in terms of getting a handle on what's actually happening. But it's undeniably happening. It's quite obviously happening. But it's a transcendental event. It's happening in a way that makes no sense. So you could say it's essentially miraculous. So we have this very strange sort of sort of a condition in which it's completely actual, completely specific, completely obvious, and entirely transcendental and miraculous and unfathomable. Which seems as if they would be opposites or mutually exclusive, but that's not how it is. It's very, which of course contributes to the strangeness of the whole thing.
The strangeness is entertaining.
Oh, it's exquisite. It's entertaining. It's beautiful. It's fascinating. It's the stuff of all art and all beauty. I mean, it's just wonderful. And it's very poignant because we are it. So it's also being with our own flavor and the mystery of ourselves, and being with the strangeness.
It's funny, before I used to think that I had a flavour or a typical feeling. Now it seems that it's a bottomless or forever expanding possibilities, not literally, but possibilities of identifying energy within that I'm experiencing. I can identify energies out there. Inside it seems to be indescribable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's very strange because again, it's just paradoxical. It's very strange. One has a particular. So you could say your karma has a particular flavor, but then that flavor is infinite, which makes it, even though it's particular, it's not particular. So the whole thing is just very strange,
Very strange. But delightful.
Oh, it's absolutely delightful. It's exquisite. Because it's so profound. It's made of pure intelligence, so it's just absolutely educating and meaningful and profound, and there's endless spin-offs. I mean, there's entire universes of just implication in any phenomena. It's just so,
And yet it's fractal.
Oh, completely. Yeah.
You can go in and in and in and in, and there it all is again.
Yeah. Yeah. So you get your choice. You have that or you have suffering. You make the call.
It's amazing how many people choose suffering.
The vast majority, apparently. To all appearances.
Would you mind if I read something?
No.
It's short. I got it as the end of an email. And if you interpret it in terms of being the hyperspatial infinity instead of necessarily another karmic personality, this is kind of interesting. It says it's a matter of switching gears, never looking back, and becoming that person today that you always dreamed you'd be. Entertain every thought, say every word, and make every decision from their point of view. Walk the way they would, dress the way they would dress, and spend your free time the way they would spend theirs. Choose the friends they would choose, eat the meals they would eat, and love and appreciate yourself the way they would. These steps must come in order for there to be change. There's no other option, no other way. But since that person is who you really are, that makes this assignment downright effortless. Just stop being who you aren't. I thought it was interesting in terms of things just will remain the same unless there is something to shift the karmic patterns that are so strong in perpetuating something that you have known to be.
Well, there's a lot of this. It's dizzying trying to trying to interpret that. But right away, when you say shift to karmic patterns, I would say that is actually perpetuating the karmic patterns. The thing to do with karmic patterns is see them, not try and change them. And seeing them essentially is like popping a balloon, and then you don't need to change them. Which paradoxically changes them.
But if you don't do something, they just seem to grind on and on. And if it's not
No, nothing grinds on and on because everything changes and morphs. I disagree. The problem with wanting to change your karmic patterns is you're investing in them as having importance, which perpetuates your investment in karmic patterns in general, being with your life in terms of the karmic patterns. Whereas if you just completely ignore the karmic patterns and go with the energy, i.e. be with your experience as a presence rather than as interpreted, defined circumstances.
That's what I meant. Do it as being that, as being the actual presence.
Right. Sure, that's fine. Yeah, that's a very different thing than changing circumstance or changing pattern.
It's like trying to change galaxies. You can't. You can identify them.
Well, you don't need to change
You don't need
galaxies,
to
though.
change
You can
them.
discover, you see the galaxy and you discover it's not a galaxy, and all of a sudden it becomes moot.
Yeah.
What frees karmic patterns is not fixing them or changing them, but simply seeing them, and then they dissolve, and you discover they don't actually exist in the way you thought they were. With a lot of elasticity and creativity, it would be possible to interpret that quote in terms that I could say were meaningful. But on its face value, it's too oriented towards getting from one condition to another condition, and that as a strategy is the very nature of empowering conditions as opposed to empowering presence, which transcends conditions.
Conditions don't disappear though.
No, they don't, but they are conditions. It's just like a dream. It's just exactly like a dream. The conditions, i.e. the patterns in the dream, don't disappear when you go lucid, but when you go lucid you see they're not there. And you see they're not patterns, they're not things, they're not even conditions, they're just a light show in your imagination. So without going away, the entire what it actually consists of is seen to be entirely different than you had thought. I mean, that's really a simple way to put it. You could look at conditions in a dream in terms of trying to turn a difficult dream into a good dream, or you could just look at a dream and just notice you're dreaming. And at that point, it doesn't matter if the conditions are apparently bad or good, because it's just a dream. And so you're completely free of conditions without needing them to disappear and without needing them to be other than they are. And they continually become other than they are because dreams are unstable and unspecific anyway.
Well, let's say, given this situation, which is not a dream, you see all of a sudden the karmic pattern stops, or you just see there's a moment of clarity.
Mm-hmm.
So it just disappears.
Mm-hmm.
It's gone.
Mm-hmm.
But then what?
Then what?
Then that clarity doesn't stay necessarily.
Right.
You can't live like that.
Right. And when that clarity goes, what is it? What is it when clarity goes?
Well, it's another energy.
Yeah. Yeah, clarity clarity coming and going. See that the clarity of energy presence does not come and go. Energy presence doesn't come and go. A clarity that can come and go is an interpreted clarity. You're interpreting some pattern as clarity versus some other pattern you're interpreting as unclear. But the energy is always clearly present, right? When you're in unclarity and confusion, that is clearly present, and that's the important clarity.
Didn't you just say that when you notice, then it just disappears? I mean, when you notice a karmic pattern,
Right.
then it disappears. So it doesn't matter.
Yeah, essentially. Well, we have to be. Language is very imprecise.
I know.
It doesn't vanish, but it disappears as a karmic pattern, and it reveals itself as an energy presence, which completely transcends being a karmic pattern.
For that moment.
Phew.
Well, for all time, because that's what it is.
There seems to me there are two sorts of people, two ways of looking at this. One are people who try to analyze and interpret, and the other realize the ones who realize there's nothing to analyze and nothing to interpret.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're in the first case, you're never going to resolve
Right.
your
Yeah.
issues.
Because essentially you're in interpretation.
Absolutely.
You're in fantasizing about your experience, and in the other case, you're simply noticing your experience. You're being with your experience directly. In which case, you can see what it actually is. The problem with interpretations is it induces error. Interpretations are always inaccurate. Not sometimes inaccurate, and not largely inaccurate, entirely and always inaccurate. Just like interpretations in a dream. Oh, this looks like a monster is chasing me. I better run away. You know, that's not like almost right or not quite right. It's entirely wrong because it's a dream. So there's no monster and there's no chasing. You know, and likewise, I might say, I might interpret this. Oh, we're sitting around the house in the living room having a conversation. That's entirely wrong. There's no house. There's no living room. There's no conversation. What's happening is a whole other order of otherness than anything that's even remotely like that. Literally and actually.
And there's no we and there's no city.
Yeah, all of that. And that's not being. I'm being literally, accurately factual in saying that. That's literally how it is. And you see that when you see your experience without interpreting, because the only thing that's present when you see your experience without interpretation is your experience. It's not even your experience at that point, it's just experience. And if this is experience, how could it be a room? If this is experience, how could it be people? It's experience. I'm not a person, I'm an experience. Just notice the fact that you're experiencing experience. That's all. You're not experiencing a world. You're not experiencing a social situation. You're experiencing a field of experience, which is literally energy presence, let's call it.
How do you do that?
You're always doing that.
Sorry.
You're always doing that.
But these categories, they're just right there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
That's
when
okay.
When you say that, I'll try to let go of all those things. And,
You don't need to let go of them. Just you're not letting go of them is also an experience.
yeah.
That they seem to be present and that you seem to be invested in them, or let's say seems to be the dominant mode that you go to, is also just experience. So it's not a matter of letting go of something.
It's being in your mind. I mean, it's thinking.
Yeah, but that's an experience too. But that's being in your mind is an interpretation. It's just experience, right? Where's your mind but an experience? Where's this room but an experience? Where's the world but an experience? And the experience is just this inconceivable field that is you. Right? I mean, this is literally and obviously true. It's the only truth. And it doesn't go counter to the interpretations. The interpretations are that. They exist within that. You don't need to be not interpreting, just see that the interpretations are experienced. It's like when you're running away from the monster in the dream and you go lucid, you don't need to stop running. You can still be running away from the monster, but at that point you're laughing because you're running away from a monster in such a dream, so who gives a shit? You don't need to stop interpreting. You don't need to stop thinking. You don't need to stop, caring about things and doing the things you like and hating the things you don't like and getting pissed off about the things that piss you off. Just see what they are. Just see it, and you'll see inconceivable, what we call experience. This is this astounding field of presence.
Without an investment.
Even if there's an investment, that's just experience. Right? What else is there? Where else is there?
I used to think, when I heard from you and other people, it can't be said, that it was A, a cop-out, or B, they hadn't yet thought of the right way to say it. But now I know that it can't be said. So it's all beating around a bush that actually isn't there.
Yeah.
Well, that
You
don't need to beat around.
It's like trying to draw a circle with straight lines. The best you can do is tangents. But the tangents are not the circle. So you have to do a bazillion tangents, and then you kind of have outlined the circle, but you still haven't drawn a circle. You're just drawing a bunch of lines.
It looks like a circle.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I do. This can't be said. I mean, I keep talking about it. But fortunately, here we're not limited to words, so I have a little bit more of an advantage.
Peter, there's a couple of questions from the internet. One is sort of a two-part. Does energy itself, without interpretation and thought, have karma? And then there's this flurry of discussion about
one thing at a time.
Karma.
One thing at a time. Energy does not have karma, but what we call karma is actually energy. And karma is a misinterpretation of energy. Karma is the apparent pattern that energy seems to have, but energy is actually unpatterned. Energy appears to be patterned if you don't look too closely, because superficially it has coherent patterns. But when you look more closely, the patterns turn out to be infinite and fractal, so they don't actually resolve to anything. It's like the shape of a cloud. You can say, oh, clouds have shape. It's like, yeah, right. If you just glance at it, you can say, oh, yeah, that cloud looks, sort of like, whatever. But then you start looking closely, and you get closer, and you fly around it, and you zoom into it, and you get out your electron microscope, and all of a sudden, what shape is the cloud? It's like, whoo! You can't possibly pin it down. You can't find it. It doesn't not have shape, but it doesn't have shape. It seems to have shape if you don't look too closely.
So in a sense, I mean, this gets back to what Irma was talking about earlier. I mean, you're just sort of misinterpreting karma by thinking that it's solid, or you could change it to another solid and it would be better.
Sure.
Because it's not. It's okay.
And again, think of a dream. In a dream, it seems like, there's people and circumstances and things around me and things going on and things I'm trying to do and all that. But if you had the wherewithal to actually look closer, you'd see that dream things aren't anything. They're squishy. They're strange. They're morphing. They don't resolve into anything. And the same thing applies to these patterns, these apparent patterns that exist in waking conditions. You know, they only appear to be coherent if you don't look too closely. And that not looking too closely is karma. When you look closely, karma dissolves because it is revealed to be an inaccurate approximation.
They all say thank you.
That example of the cloud, I've never heard you say that before. That's just really phenomenal. I love that.
Well, think of it. I mean, you know. But it applies to anything whatsoever. What shape is anything? You know, you glance at it and you go, oh, it's shaped just like this. You know, the computer's kind of a rectangle. So, okay, yeah, right. Look closer. What shape is it? It's like, you know. I could spend the rest of my life with this computer and I would always be seeing a different shape. Always. You know, so which one is the shape of the computer? You know, it's absurd. They all are. But the computer is all of that and more. I could spend 1,000,000 lifetimes with this computer and I would still see a different shape every instant. I mean, we all grapple with this by the constant conundrum. What do I look like? You look in the mirror and you go, what do I look like? Well, I look, you know, you look closer and it's weird. You know, you can't tell what you look like because you don't look like anything. It's too complex. It's too subtle. It's infinite. You know, every time you've ever seen your face in the mirror, it looks different. I mean, these aren't abstractions. This is a concrete fact. The ideas of coherence is the abstraction. The idea that things have a finite and fixed and objective stability and appearance and what have you. That's the fantasy. That's the abstraction.
So then, you've spoken of integration before. Can you define that again?
Of which kind? In what context?
Just, when you start to notice.
Oh, right.
Okay. Yeah, there's integration.
Yeah. Well, integration in this context is becoming acclimatized to the actual perspective that noticing reveals in the context of continuing to live your life and continuing to. Well, this answers the question of Ernest, what now? Then what? To carrying on in the face of that perspective or lack thereof. And this is something that is developed. It teaches itself. It establishes itself, seemingly over a period of time.
So, what happens to all the abstractions?
Nothing. They don't go anywhere. You can continue to do abstractions, but you're aware that they're abstractions.
Okay.
You're aware that they are themselves radiant presence.
Yeah, because one thing that I have observed in my experience is that I'm observing the abstractions going on in the background, but I don't know what's happening out here. But I hear, I see and experience, or I sense stuff going on in the background, like I hear people talking, or I see, there's just this sense of something, which just has to be an abstraction because I have a conception about it.
Right.
So that kind of just goes on.
Sure, everything. Yeah, this is not about changing anything. This is just about seeing what this is. And when you see what it is, it of course continues to be what it is and has always been. But you see what it actually is and has always been that you have not been aware of. And so that is noticing, and that is what integration is with that perspective in the context of everything going on as it always has. It's actually about break time. Why don't we take our customary 10-minute break and be back shortly.
Got a little bell over there you can ring? Should ring your bell.
What was in those little pastry cup things? The triangular pastries?
Sweet potato.
I know you've said this before, but since you were talking about the face, you look at it over and over, it's always different. But there's something there that you know it's you anyway.
Mm-hmm.
What? How would you talk about that?
It's mysterious. You know, that we can meaningfully, patterns are meaningful, and they are recognizable even though they aren't ultimately resolvable. And that that fact is also unresolvable, and you can't get to the bottom of how that works or what's up with it. But, you know, in terms of sort of remedial experiencing, we're very expert at being with patterns meaningfully, and we're generally not very expert at being with the open-endedness of patterns. So I tend to emphasize that. The meaningfulness doesn't go away. In fact, it becomes enriched in the context of the actuality. But the way in which that works and what that actually consists of is of course, ultimately unresolvable. But it becomes an expression of the intelligence, which is the meaningfulness of all of these characteristics that present an experience, right? In other words, there's this vast range of characteristics and qualities and patterns that are expressing, and they're all vehicles of a profound meaningfulness and a profound intelligence, which again we're all very familiar with in terms of, you know, I mean, just superficially the characteristics and qualities of people and objects and things like that. So we all know that aspect of it. And of course that is actual and intrinsic. But again, it's unresolvable and not as simplistic and coherent as we're used to thinking it is.
So the recognizability of something is the expression of the meaningfulness of reality.
Yes, precisely. And having said that, what that means can't be pinned down. In fact, this could be said to be an ongoing and eternal exploration of what that means. You know, experience consists of engaging with meaningfulness in terms of patterns and characteristics, and you know exactly what that is and how it works and the point of it and what it does and how it develops and so on is unfathomable. And no doubt is intrinsically unfathomable. But that doesn't negate it. On the contrary, that enriches it because it reveals it in its true context.
was just how you look at art. I know you've said that hundreds of times, but that's the most obvious.
Sure. It's a very good example because it's something that we all are very familiar with. Art is nice to use as an example because it's one of the few things in experience that is more or less explicitly what it actually is. Art is using form and specifics to imply an intangible, open-ended meaningfulness.
It's nonverbal.
And in the context of it, that is nonverbal and unresolvable, which is simply a specific example of what everything is. But art is that explicitly, which is makes it rather rare. And within the human, sort of worldview.
Peter, what's going on when some things, some phenomena or experience just presents itself? It's so much more vibrant or clearly than just sort of usual. I mean, is that because I'm sort of in some kind of noticing mode, or is it a quality of the? I mean, well, it's not the object, but the quality of the energy or the experience.
No, that's noticing. Noticing is appreciating the way experience actually appears, which is always startlingly vibrant and surprising and present and multidimensional. Experience is always doing that.
But it just sort of sometimes seems that sometimes it seems as if it's a quality of the circumstance or the phenomena or the object itself. I mean, and I have to sort of step back and just sort of appreciate it, I guess.
I mean, it's sure, it's interesting though. Noticing can seem to be triggered by phenomena. For example, you see a beautiful sunset. It's typically a more obvious trigger to noticing than standing at an intersection watching cars go by, maybe.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
But it's arbitrary, and why that should be the way why that should be that way is mysterious.
Don't you think it's more a function of what we automatically, subliminally call ordinary, like standing at an intersection?
Yeah.
And when we see a beautiful sunset, we don't see one every day, whereas we see intersections every day.
Perhaps,
So
yeah.
somehow or other we interpret them
Yeah, perhaps.
unconsciously.
But basically,
So it frees us up to see more clearly, more noticing.
Sure. But basically, it's just a matter of noticing, and anything whatsoever, any experience seen in its true context will be just like a spectacular sunset.
Yeah.
In terms of being shocking and stark and vibrant and surprising and multidimensional and so on and so forth. However.
Yeah, that's what sort of makes me suspect that it's more the noticing or the being there.
Yeah.
That's the most important part,
Yeah,
not
of course.
anything about the quality of
Yeah. Noticing is and certainly can be independent of circumstance. So everyone has noticing in their lives, whether they acknowledge it or not, or appreciate it or not. But as you get better at noticing, you will be able to have noticing more and more independent of circumstances. So you will be able to, be in a Starbucks or being on a street corner or be anywhere and really get the full whammy of what's actually there.
Mm-hmm.
Surely the actual noticing itself is completely separated from circumstance.
Right. Exactly so.
I'm sorry, John, separate from what?
Circumstances.
Independent, not dependent on circumstances.
Not necessarily separate, but not.
But nonetheless, circumstances can apparently trigger it, particularly if you're not very heavily into noticing. But there's no way to sort that out or anything. So. From a practical point of view, use noticing any way you can. So if circumstances trigger noticing for you, then take advantage of that fact. And if you're able to do noticing beyond circumstances, that's great. Take advantage of that fact.
Well, I just remember that exercise we did when we were up at Rottnell Lane and looking at the sky. I mean, that's something we see every day, right? And, you didn't really think about it. It would just be sort of plain.
Sure. Noticing is not about the supposed thing you're noticing. Noticing is about experience.
Exactly.
Noticing is about noticing experience. And of course, experience is experience, whatever the supposed object or apparent, experiential circumstances that seems to be present in experience. Noticing is shifting from defining your experience as being of circumstances to being of experience. So you notice the medium rather than the apparent, targets virtual targets of experience.
There's a question from the internet about noticing. Well, let's see. How do you know that noticing is an imaginary, or how can you be sure that presence isn't being imagined?
Good question. Tricky dickies in there. What are they doing? Very good.
Well, it's irrelevant.
It's what?
Irrelevant. Be with presence. Be with noticing however you can. Be with presence however you can. Your entire experience might be imagined. But what does that mean? I mean, it means whether something's imagined or not is just a qualification. You know, even if it's imagined, an imagination is imagined. Imaginings are present, or you wouldn't experience them. So even if it's imagined, you can be with the presence of that imagining, and that presence is presence. And even if you're imagining presence, that imagined presence is present, or you wouldn't experience it. So that's actual, whether it's imagined or not. The very nature of noticing is that it's outside of qualification, and whether something's imagined or not is a qualification. So presence is presence, whether you're qualifying it as imaginary or actual or physical or consciousness-based or virtual or whatever adjective you want to put in front of it.
But I can see how that would be a way to slip into thinking, into believing the thinking rather than noticing it.
Sure, you can use anything as a basis for delusion.
It's a trick.
You can use anything whatsoever as a basis for misunderstanding,
Yeah.
and that's
a good one.
fine. So it's a matter of having your karma be sufficiently unfolded that you are beginning to experience and appreciate actual noticing in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Until that point, you may play games that you call noticing that isn't acknowledged as being that. But that's what most spirituality consists of anyway, so that's fine. Most spirituality is people playing it, being spiritual. And I'm sure that you can play it noticing. Why not?
Peter, you say that presence is indefinable, and you mentioned hyperdimensional.
Mm-hmm.
So hyperdimensional means that it seems like it has It's dimension. I mean, what do you?
When I use that notion, I'm trying to indicate that presence can have arbitrary, seemingly different and divergent aspects to it, and you can't pin it down.
Okay. And it is indefinable.
Absolutely, everything's indefinable. If you define something, you're approximating it, because things are intrinsically infinite and open-ended and unresolvable. You know, in fact, even though those are abstractions, but the fact is nonetheless that fact.
Can you say something about the trickster?
What about the trickster?
What is the trickster?
Trickster is a personification of the slipperiness of reality.
I like a trickster.
Yeah, well, it's wonderful. I mean, that's essentially what we're talking about. Things are intrinsically unresolvable and intrinsically open-ended in the sense that they present as many qualities as you choose to look for you can find without limit, so which is very tricky. So I would say that the prime principle of the trickster principle is unresolvability.
You say personification, that's how it's normally thought of, but it goes beyond personifications.
Well, calling it a trickster
Yeah.
is a personification.
Yeah.
But that indicates and embodies an actual principle.
A trickster shows
Yeah,
things.
things are slippery. Things are nebulous. Things are dreamlike. Things are, neither this nor that, and yet both this and that, and beyond all of that, and so that intrinsic unresolvability and incoherence, while yet having arbitrary degrees of coherence, is all very tricky and slippery and paradoxical.
Well, I like the trickster's attribute of taking pleasure in the deceit.
Mm. Sure, and again, that personifies that this is all essentially, an enjoyment. It's a joyous exploration. It's an art form. Obviously it can't be proved or resolved conclusively to being any of these sorts of things, but it has those elements, elements of these kinds of qualities in it intrinsically, very obviously. It's a blissful, ecstatic dance of, possibilities and characteristics and exploration and meaningfulnesses, and what a show.
With the fundamental trick being this Brazilian fabrication of identity.
Yeah. It's endless spinning off of meanings that are both true and untrue simultaneously. That are both meaningful and accurate and profound and frivolous and superficial simultaneously. Which again is ultimately, aspect of this profound indeterminacy or unresolvability. That any and all conditions can seem to be this, that, and the other simultaneously, and you can never pin it down.
but it relentlessly presents as if,
Yeah.
as if.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then if it's examined, then it shifts, and it's as if something else.
Yeah. There's all these as ifs, and you go and pursue them and try and pin them down, and they evaporate like a mirage to be replaced by, as many more as you choose to look for, which also evaporate, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
The slipperiness.
And when you really, like, oh yeah, I see it now, then it just populates
Yeah.
to fulfill that. It's like, oh,
Sure.
you're right.
Yeah.
It fixed it.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
So the question's still worried about. I say I notice, but how can I be sure I'm not imagining it? More to the point, is Peter sure he is not imagining it? If so, how?
Well, it's irrelevant whether you're imagining it. Find presence. Don't worry about whether you're imagining it. If it's present, it's present. And be with that. Feel that. Feel what that is. If it's imaginary, fine. But if it's imaginary, it's still present. Be with that presence and feel what it is. And presence, by its very nature, will open. It will reveal more. It will go into. I don't know how to put this. It will become transcendent. It's not static. And ultimately, distinctions between imaginary and unimaginary become irrelevant because there's always a component of abstraction and imagination present in experience, just like there's always a characteristics of direct energy presence, and they are all one and the same, and they're inextricable. You can't separate them out. So there's always fantasy and imagination in experience. But there's always actuality as well. When you're having a fantasy, you're actually having it. It's actually present.
You're actually, that's true.
So, sure, there's fantasy, but there's also actuality. And likewise, when you're seeing something, you're being very concretely engaged in, what you qualify usually as sensory experience. At the same time, you're immersed in a sea of fantasies and imaginations about what's going on, happening at the same time, subliminally. So you can't separate those out. So that distinction is not so important. And the main thing with noticing is to get mileage out of it, not to worry about defining it. Noticing is like stepping through a doorway. The main thing about it is not to worry about the door, but to go through it.
But there is an awareness of having passed through that door.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
You do recognize.
Yeah. And if the question is it possible to be lost in delusion and pretend you're noticing, and not be getting any actual mileage out of it because you're just a crazy person? The answer is yes, definitely, by all means. You could spend lifetimes imagining you're noticing, just like you can spend lifetimes imagining you're doing anything. But not to worry, because this is your karmic unfoldment, which takes care of itself in its own time, and when it's time for you to get real, you will get real. Until then, you won't. So it's not like you need to worry about it's a self-regulating system, you might say.
In my experience, that kind of question really often comes at a point where the imagined self, the imagined individuality, might actually break apart, and its last dodge is to say, how can you be sure of something outside of yourself? And are you sure? But it's referring to something that doesn't exist. And it comes from a being that doesn't exist. So the question itself is, almost an effort to maintain the illusion of the self.
Yeah, it's ultimately unimportant. Yeah, it's ultimately unimportant. If you want to do noticing, if you're drawn to that, then do noticing. And you're either doing it actually, or you're deluding yourself, or some combination thereof. And that will go to what it goes to. which is which is what always happens in life. You do what you're interested in, which goes to what it goes to. What else is new? It's always been that way. And even unreality always inevitably leads to reality because there's nowhere else for it to go. Everyone who's ever realized reality will tell you that the root to their realizing reality was delusion. So delusion leads to realization. The spiritual path is delusion. It leads to realization.
Would it be valid to say that one realizes that delusion is not delusion, it's transcendental?
Absolutely. When realization occurs, it's the discovery of what delusion is. It's not necessarily the cessation of delusion.
Mm-hmm.
Realization is discovering what this is and has always been. It's not a change of condition or where one thing ceases and another thing starts. And of course, when you notice what this is and has always been, that's what it is and has always been. So it's not going to become anything else all of a sudden. But it turns out to be some entirely, radically, inconceivably different and beyond what you ever thought it was. And so delusion itself is so far beyond being what you thought of as delusion as to be laughable. Of course, it feels itself to be transcendental radiance. And where's the problem in that? Where's the downside?
Delusion is literally a dream.
Yes, it is.
Where's the problem in that?
Well, you know, Peter, in a way, I sort of asked this in a different way, but I'd asked if questioning, I defined it as a problem, you know, or a circumstance, but questioning the circumstance or a problem, would that be a way to some type of, you know, realization? And I think what I was saying was, eventually when you look at a circumstance or notice it or a problem, you'll get to that it is a delusion.
Mm-hmm.
And once you see that, then you see this.
Yeah, as with anything, it depends upon the intelligence with which you do it. You can do anything stupidly, and you can do anything intelligently.
Yeah.
And if you're doing any kind of intelligent investigation ultimately reveals reality. Any kind of stupid investigation probably is going to perpetuate Stupidity.
Well, I was assuming.
but may stumble on the reality eventually.
Right, no, I was assuming I was doing it.
Well, of course.
Of course.
Present company accepted.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's, but, I mean, I have worked on doing that.
And of course, intelligence isn't cleverness. Intelligence is noticing itself. Intelligence is transcendental intelligence, or inherent intelligence, which
Well,
is
it's
not.
being very critical and very persistent, and just not taking any bullshit, you know.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. If you can do that really precisely, yeah. Sure.
Sort of like cutting a knot.
Sure.
Like you cut it in the right, the Gordian knot in the right place.
Yeah. Tibetans might call that wielding the sword of Manjushri.
Of what?
Manjushri. Manjushri is the bodhisattva who carries the sword of discrimination, the sword of transcendental discrimination that cuts through delusion.
Yeah, that's what happened.
That's what I'm talking about.
That's what we're talking about. Girl.
Bring it.
No horsing around. That's it. That's good. Read it.
Well, it's about quitting time. So good night, online people.